Hey there, night owls and history lovers. Welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into something truly unsettling, something that'll make you grateful for modern plumbing and antibiotics. So get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, and let's ease into this together. Because what you're about to hear is going to change how you see the most famous king in English history. In 1547, King Henry VIII died in agony. His body was so swollen, so infected, so utterly ravaged that his coffin exploded during transport. Fluids leaked through the wood. Dogs reportedly licked at the remains. This wasn't just decay, this was the final act of a man whose hygiene practices were so catastrophically disgusting that his own body became a biohazard. No one talks about this. They talk about his 6 wives, his break from Rome, his portraits in gold and velvet. But behind that regal facade was a rotting, festering, walking nightmare of medieval filth. What Henry VIII did to his own body, and the bodies of those around him, will make your skin crawl. And what's worse, he was considered clean for his time. Let's start with the most famous horror of Henry's court, the groom of the stool. You've probably heard of this position, maybe laughed about it. A nobleman whose job was to literally wipe the king's backside after he used the toilet. But here's what they don't tell you. The groom of the stool didn't just wipe, he analysed. He examined the king's feces for colour, consistency, smell. He reported back to physicians. He was essentially a walking colonoscopy in velvet robes. And this wasn't done in privacy. Henry would sit on his velvet-lined close stool, a portable throne with a chamber pot underneath, often while conducting state business. Ambassadors, courtiers, even bishops would stand nearby, pretending not to hear the sounds, pretending not to smell the stench. The groom would kneel, wait, then perform his duty with a damp cloth while Henry continued talking about France or the Pope, or which wife he planned to behead next. Imagine being that groom. Imagine the smell, the heat, the visual horror of a king whose diet consisted of roasted meats, sugared pastries, and gallons of ale, all fermenting in his royal intestines. And here's the twisted part. This was a prestigious position. The groom of the stool had the king's ear, literally. He had access, influence, power, but he also had feces under his fingernails. Listen, the psychological toll of this job, nobody talks about that. These weren't servants, these were nobles, men like Sir Henry Norris, Sir Anthony Denny, men who'd been educated, who'd fought in wars, who had estates and titles, and every morning they'd kneel before their king and wipe shit off a hemorrhoid-ravaged arse. Some days Henry's bowels were loose, explosive. The groom would be splattered, his expensive doublet ruined. The smell would cling to him for hours no matter how many times he tried to wash his hands in rose water. Other days Henry was constipated. The groom would wait and wait, sometimes for an hour while the king grunted and strained, his face purple, veins bulging in his neck. And when something finally emerged, hard, painful, bloody, the groom had to inspect it, comment on it, reassure the king that the humours were balanced. They weren't. The humours were never balanced. Henry's diet was a biological weapon, and the worst part, the groom couldn't refuse, couldn't resign, couldn't even look disgusted. He had to maintain a neutral expression while handling the king's waste, had to speak respectfully while surrounded by the evidence of royal digestive failure. One groom, according to court whispers, developed a nervous twitch. His hands would shake uncontrollably during meals. Another took to drinking heavily before his shifts, which only made the king suspicious. Because Henry noticed everything. If the groom hesitated, if he gagged, if his face showed even a flicker of revulsion, the king would remember, and remembered slights became dangerous. Henry's hemorrhoids, which we'll get to, made this job even more unbearable. The king's backside was a landscape of infected tissue, open sores, and chronic pain. The groom wasn't just wiping, he was navigating a battlefield, and he did it every single day, multiple times a day, for years. The groom of the stool wasn't a servant, he was a martyr, a man who sacrificed his dignity, his nostrils, and probably his will to live, all to stay close to power. Here's what no one tells you about medieval medicine. Physicians believed that examining feces could predict the future. Dark stool meant too much black bile. Depression, possibly death. Pale stool meant liver problems. Bloody stool meant, well, that was complicated. Sometimes it meant hemorrhoids, sometimes internal bleeding, sometimes demon possession. The groom had to be fluent in this fecal prophecy. He'd describe the stool to physicians, who'd stroke their beards and prescribe more leeches or another mercury purge. And through it all, the groom maintained his smile, maintained his position, maintained the fiction that this was a normal, dignified job worthy of a nobleman. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's digestive issues weren't just inconvenient. They were symptomatic of something far worse happening inside his body. What he did about those symptoms, or rather, what he didn't do, reveals a shocking truth about Tudor medicine. In 1536, during a jousting tournament, Henry was thrown from his horse. A horse in full armour. The animal landed on top of him. The impact shattered his leg. The wound became infected almost immediately, and it never, ever healed. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Henry VIII walked around with an open, weeping, festering leg ulcer. Let that sink in. 11 years. The wound was about the size of a tennis ball, maybe larger. Chroniclers described it as leaking continuously. Physicians packed it with linen soaked in herbs and egg whites, then wrapped it in bandages. But here's the thing about bandages in Tudor England. They weren't sterile. They weren't washed. They were reused, sometimes for weeks. The smell was apocalyptic. Courtiers could smell Henry coming from rooms away. Not just the wound itself, but the rot, the infection, the dying tissue underneath. One ambassador wrote that the stench was so overpowering he had to excuse himself from the king's presence to vomit. And Henry? He just kept going. He limped through council meetings, through banquets, through executions. The wound leaked through the bandages, soaking into his hose, his shoes, leaving a trail of pus and blood wherever he walked. You need to hear this part. The servants who handled Henry's leg bandages had one of the worst jobs in the palace. They'd unwrap the putrid cloths, trying not to breathe, trying not to look too closely at what came off with them. Sometimes chunks of dead tissue would stick to the bandages, grey, necrotic flesh that had to be peeled away. The servants would burn these bandages immediately, but the smell would linger in their clothes, their hair, their nightmares. Fresh bandages would be prepared. Linen strips soaked in a mixture of egg whites, turpentine, and whatever herbs the physician believed would draw out the corruption. Rose petals for their scent, comfrey for healing. Sometimes ground up pearls because expensive ingredients must work better, right? They didn't. The servants would wrap the leg as gently as possible, but Henry would still wince, still curse, still threaten to have them whipped if they weren't careful. They'd tie the bandages tight enough to hold, but not so tight they cut off circulation. A delicate balance when dealing with an increasingly unstable king. And within hours, the bandages would be soaked through again. Fresh pus, fresh blood. The cycle never ended. Occasionally, the wound would close, and physicians would celebrate, but then Henry's body would poison itself. The infection trapped inside would cause fevers, delirium, rage, so they'd reopen the wound on purpose with a hot iron to let the bad humours out. Imagine the scene. The king, already in agony, being held down while a red-hot poker was pressed into his festering leg. The smell of burning flesh, the screaming, the certainty that this was medicine. The poker would be heated in the fireplace until it glowed orange. The physician would test it on a piece of wood. If it sizzled, it was ready. Then he'd approach the king, who'd be held down by 4 strong men. Henry's hands would grip the chair arms. His knuckles would turn white, and then the searing. The flesh would bubble. Steam would rise. The infection would literally boil. Henry's screams would echo through the palace, and courtiers in distant rooms would wince and pour another cup of wine. Afterward, Henry would be pale, sweating, shaking. But the physicians would nod approvingly. "The corruption has been expelled, Your Majesty." It hadn't. It never was. And it didn't work, obviously, because the wound would just start leaking again. The cycle continued: open, infected, closed, poisoned, reopened, infected, for over a decade. But what Henry didn't realise was that this leg wound wasn't just a physical problem. It was rotting his personality, his mind, his entire court from the inside out. However, even more disturbing is what modern doctors believe that wound actually was. Modern physicians who've studied Henry's case believe his leg wound wasn't just a surface injury. They think it was osteomyelitis, a bone infection. And if you've never heard of osteomyelitis, consider yourself lucky. It's one of the most painful, most persistent infections a human can endure. The bacteria don't just attack flesh. They burrow into the bone itself. They eat it, hollow it out, turn it into crumbling, rotting calcium. And in Tudor England, there was no cure, no antibiotics, no surgical debridement, just suffering. Endless, relentless suffering. The infection likely started in the marrow of Henry's femur or tibia. From there it spread through the bone, creating pockets of pus, fragments of dead tissue, and eventually fistulas, tunnels through which the infection leaked to the surface. That's what courtiers were smelling. Not just infected skin, infected bone. Ever broken a bone? Remember that deep, sick ache? Now imagine that ache, but it's also on fire. And it never stops. And it's eating you from the inside. That's osteomyelitis. The pain would have been unbearable. A constant throbbing, grinding agony that no amount of wine or poppy syrup could dull. And it would have gotten worse with every step. Every movement, every attempt to stand or kneel, or even shift weight. Henry's infamous mood swings, his paranoia, his rage, his sudden violent outbursts may have been directly linked to this. Chronic pain rewires the brain. It makes you irritable, irrational, cruel, and Henry became all of those things. Modern pain researchers have studied the psychological effects of chronic pain. After about 6 months, the brain begins to change. The neurons that process pain become hypersensitive. The emotional regulation centers, the prefrontal cortex, start to atrophy. The amygdala, which processes fear and anger, becomes overactive. In short, chronic pain makes you mean, makes you paranoid, makes you unable to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. Henry experienced this for 11 years. Wives were beheaded, advisors were executed, friends were discarded. Anyone who displeased him, even slightly, risked the axe. And all the while, his leg continued to rot. But here's the truly horrifying part. Physicians believed that draining the infection was keeping him alive. They thought if the wound closed completely, the bad humours would poison his heart. So they kept it open, deliberately. They even gave it a name, the issue, as in, we must maintain the king's issue. The wound wasn't a problem to solve. It was a feature to maintain. Some physicians argued that Henry had lived such a long life because of the leg wound. They pointed to nobles who died shortly after similar wounds healed. See, the wound was protective, safety valve. This is like saying a leak in your boat is keeping you safe because at least you can see where the water's coming from. They were torturing him in the name of healing. And Henry, desperate for relief, let them. He submitted to their hot irons, their herbal poultices, their bloodletting, their leeches. He believed them when they said this was the only way. It wasn't. It was making everything worse. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's leg infection was just one symptom of a body in systemic collapse. What he did to try to fix his other ailments reveals a shocking truth about Tudor delusion and desperation. Let's talk about Henry's bowels, because if the leg wound was bad, his digestive system was a war zone. Henry VIII was chronically constipated, not occasionally, not just after a heavy meal, constantly. his diet was almost entirely meat. Roasted boar, venison, swan, peacock, beef, mutton, pork, sometimes 6 or 7 types of meat in a single sitting, washed down with gallons of ale and wine. Vegetables, considered peasant food, dangerous even. Fruit, only in pies heavily sugared. Fibre, essentially non-existent, so his intestines were a graveyard. Food would sit there, rotting, fermenting, hardening into compact masses that refused to move. Days would pass, sometimes a week. Henry would become bloated, irritable, nauseous. His stomach would distend so much that courtiers whispered he looked pregnant. And you thought your bloating was bad. The pressure was unbearable. Henry would pace, clutching his stomach, unable to sit comfortably. Sleep became impossible. Every position hurt. Lying down put pressure on his intestines. Sitting compressed them further. Standing made him dizzy. His face would turn red, then purple. Sweat would pour off him. He'd grunt and strain on his close stool for hours, producing nothing. Or worse, producing tiny hard pellets that tore his hemorrhoids and made him scream. The groom of the stool would hover nearby, worried, because if the king didn't shit soon, the physicians would be called. And when the physicians were called, things got medieval. And that's when the physicians would step in with their cure. Enemas, violent medieval enemas. They'd mix water with oils, herbs, sometimes wine or vinegar. Then they'd insert a long tube, called a clyster, into Henry's rectum and force the liquid in, sometimes gallons of it. The clyster was a metal or wooden tube, about the width of your thumb, attached to a pig's bladder filled with liquid. A servant would squeeze the bladder, forcing the contents into the king's bowels. The sensation was immediate and horrifying. The cold liquid rushing in, the pressure building, the cramping, starting almost instantly. The king would be positioned on his hands and knees or lying on his side while servants held him still. The pressure was excruciating, the cramping unbearable. And then finally, the flood. Everything came out. Everything. Not just the impacted feces, but blood, mucus, bits of undigested meat. The smell was so vile that servants often fainted. The chamber pots would overflow. Servants would rush to bring more. The king would continue evacuating for what felt like hours until there was nothing left but bile-tinged water and blood. Afterward, Henry would be weak, shaking, pale as death. He'd be helped to bed, where he'd lie for hours trembling, his intestines raw and traumatized, and the physicians would declare it a success. The corrupted humours have been expelled. And this wasn't a rare procedure. This happened regularly, sometimes multiple times a month. But here's where it gets worse. Tudor physicians believed that the body needed to be purged of excess humours. So even when Henry wasn't constipated, they'd give him laxatives, powerful ones, made from mercury, antimony, senna, rhubarb. These weren't gentle remedies. They were chemical warfare on the digestive tract. The laxatives were mixed into wine or jam to mask the bitter taste. Henry would swallow them, thinking perhaps this time would be different. It never was. Within an hour the cramping would start. Then the urgency. Henry would spend entire days on his close stool, evacuating his bowels until there was nothing left but bile and blood. He'd be weak, dehydrated, shaking, and the physicians would nod approvingly and say, "The bad humours have been expelled." They were slowly poisoning him. Mercury, in particular, is a violent poison. It doesn't just purge the bowels, it damages the kidneys, the liver, the nervous system. It causes tremors, memory loss, personality changes, all symptoms Henry exhibited, all attributed to other causes, never to the medicine itself. And Henry, desperate for relief, kept coming back for more. What he didn't realise was that every purge weakened his intestines. Every enema damaged the delicate lining of his colon. Every laxative made his constipation worse in the long run. He was trapped in a cycle of suffering, and the only people who could help him were the ones making it worse. Here's what they didn't tell you. Some servants kept count. One recorded that Henry underwent enemas no less than 40 times in a single year. Another noted that the king's close stool was emptied 8 or 9 times daily during purge weeks, 8 or 9 times daily for weeks. His body couldn't absorb nutrients, couldn't maintain hydration, couldn't heal because it was constantly under assault. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's digestive agony was compounded by another horror lurking just beneath the surface. What his physicians discovered during one particularly brutal examination reveals a shocking truth about the king's collapsing body. If you thought Henry's constipation was bad, let me introduce you to the inevitable consequence. Hemorrhoids, not small ones, not the occasional flare-up you might treat with a cream from the pharmacy. We're talking swollen, engorged, bleeding masses of tissue that made sitting, standing, and existing a living hell. Henry's hemorrhoids were so severe that they're mentioned in multiple court documents. Physicians reported them as grievous and most painful to the king's person. And remember, this is Tudor England. People didn't complain about pain unless it was unbearable. Henry was a warrior king, a man who jousted, hunted, fought. If he was complaining, the pain was beyond description. Hemorrhoids occur when the veins around the rectum and anus become swollen and inflamed. Chronic constipation makes them worse. Straining makes them worse. And medieval treatments? They made them catastrophically worse. Tudor physicians had several approaches to hemorrhoids, none of them good. First, bloodletting near the anus. They believed that draining blood from the area would reduce swelling, so they take a lancet, a small sharp blade, and cut into the hemorrhoids themselves. No anesthesia, no sterile equipment, just a blade, a basin, and the king's screams. The physician would have Henry lie on his side, knees pulled to chest. Servants would hold him still, not to restrain him, but to keep him from reflexively flinching away from the blade. The lancet would pierce the swollen tissue. Blood would pour out, dark and thick, sometimes arterial spray if they hit a larger vessel. The basin would fill quickly, and Henry would bite down on a leather strap to keep from screaming loud enough for the entire palace to hear. The blood would pour out, sometimes for minutes. The king would be left weak, pale, and still in pain because the hemorrhoids would just swell back up within hours. Second, herbal suppositories. These were small bundles of cloth soaked in astringents, like witch hazel, vinegar, or alum. They'd be inserted directly into the rectum. Imagine the sensation. Already inflamed, painful tissue being irritated further by acidic herbs. Henry would writhe, sweat, curse, and the physicians would insist it was drawing out the inflammation. It wasn't. It was just torture. The suppositories had to be inserted deep, past the external hemorrhoids, past the anal sphincter, into the rectum proper. This meant someone, usually the groom of the stool, had to use their finger to push the suppository into place, through inflamed bleeding tissue, while the king gritted his teeth and gripped the arms of his chair hard enough to leave marks in the wood. Third, cauterization. Yes, hot irons, again. If the hemorrhoids became too large, too proud as they called them, physicians would burn them. They'd heat a small iron rod until it glowed red, then press it directly onto the swollen tissue. The smell was indescribable. Burning flesh, blood, feces, the sound of sizzling, the king's howls echoing through the palace. And it didn't even work. The hemorrhoids would return. Bigger, angrier. But here's the worst part. Hemorrhoids made everything else worse. Every bowel movement was agony. Every enema was torture. Every hour sitting on his throne was suffering. Think about that. The throne, the symbol of his power. The chair he sat in to rule an empire. Every minute on it was pain. The pressure on his hemorrhoids would make them throb, bleed, weep. Sometimes blood would soak through his clothing. Courtiers would notice the dark stains spreading on the back of his doublet. No one said anything. What could they say? Henry couldn't escape his own body. It had become a prison, and still he ate the same diet. Still he refused vegetables. Still, he subjected himself to the same brutal cures, because in his mind, admitting weakness, admitting that his body was failing, would be admitting defeat. And Henry VIII never admitted defeat, not to France, not to the Pope, and not to his own rotting bowels. And it gets worse. His hemorrhoids weren't just external. He had internal ones too. Swollen veins deep inside the rectum that would prolapse during bowel movements. They'd push out, raw and bleeding, and have to be manually pushed back in. The groom of the stool performed this task, using his fingers, while the king wept from the pain. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's anal suffering was just the beginning of a cascade of infections that spread to even more intimate areas. What his physicians found during one particularly invasive examination reveals a shocking truth about the king's sexual health. Let's address the elephant in the Tudor bedchamber: syphilis. Historians have debated for centuries whether Henry VIII had syphilis. Some say yes, some say no. But here's what we know for certain. Henry had something, and that something was sexually transmitted, chronically painful, and deeply, deeply shameful. Syphilis was rampant in Tudor England, called the pox, or the French disease, because everyone blamed the French. It was a death sentence delivered in stages. Stage 1. A painless sore on the genitals. Easy to miss, easy to ignore. Stage 2. A rash, fever, swollen lymph nodes. Still manageable, still ignorable if you're a king with other problems. Stage 3. The disease goes dormant. You feel fine, you think you're cured, you're not. Stage 4. Dementia, blindness, open sores, madness, death. This is where syphilis reveals its true nature. It eats your brain, your organs, your sanity. Now, did Henry have syphilis? Maybe, probably. His symptoms align: mood swings, paranoia, leg ulcers that wouldn't heal, stillborn children, miscarriages in multiple wives. But here's the thing, syphilis wasn't the only sexually transmitted infection in Tudor England. There was also gonorrhea, chlamydia, and a dozen other bacterial nightmares, all untreatable, all festering quietly. And Henry was not celibate. He had 6 wives, multiple mistresses, and rumour has it, encounters with courtiers, servants, and anonymous women during his wilder years. Each sexual encounter was a game of biological Russian roulette. If Henry did have syphilis, or any venereal disease, he would have experienced the following: burning urination, discharge, open sores on his genitals, swollen testicles, and eventually chronic pain in his groin. Listen, here's what no one tells you about venereal disease in the Tudor court. It wasn't rare, it was epidemic, but it was never discussed, never acknowledged. To admit you had the pox was to admit sexual impropriety, which was fine for a king, technically, but embarrassing nonetheless. So it was treated in secret. Late-night visits from physicians, coded language in medical records. The king's private discomfort, a malady of the lower regions. And the treatments? Oh, they were worse than the disease. Mercury. That was the go-to cure for syphilis. Mercury ointments, mercury vapours, mercury pills. Patients were locked in hot rooms and fumigated with mercury smoke until they drooled, until their gums bled, until their teeth fell out. The theory was that mercury would sweat out the disease. In reality, it was just adding mercury poisoning to an already disastrous situation. Henry's physicians would have rubbed mercury paste onto his genitals, into his sores, directly onto the infected tissue. Can you imagine? The burning, the chemical searing, the humiliation of lying there exposed while physicians examined his most intimate areas and declared the infection stubborn. The mercury paste had the consistency of thick mud, grey, metallic smelling, cold to the touch. It would be applied liberally, coating the entire genital area, then covered with linen bandages to encourage absorption. Henry would have to wear this for hours, sometimes days. The mercury would burn, not like fire, like acid, a slow chemical burning that intensified over time. And if the mercury didn't work, and it never did, they'd try bloodletting, leeches applied directly to the groin, or worse, cutting the infected areas and draining them manually. Imagine leeches on your genitals, their mouths latching onto the most sensitive skin on your body, their bodies swelling with blood, the sensation of them moving, feeding, dropping off when they were full. Henry endured this multiple times, while physicians assured him that the corrupt blood was being removed. There's no record of Henry ever publicly acknowledging a venereal disease, but there are whispers, cryptic references in letters, physicians who were sworn to secrecy, sudden disappearances of mistresses who might have known too much. And here's the kicker. If Henry did have syphilis, he likely spread it. To his wives, to his lovers, to anyone unlucky enough to share his bed. Anne Boleyn's miscarriages, Jane Seymour's death after childbirth, Catherine Howard's alleged promiscuity, which might have been her desperately seeking pleasure elsewhere because Henry's infections made intimacy unbearable. It's all connected, a web of disease, secrecy, and royal privilege that allowed one man's infections to ruin and end multiple lives. Think about Catherine of Aragon, married to Henry for 24 years. She had multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, only one surviving child. Was it age, incompatibility? Or was it syphilis, passed from husband to wife, killing their children before they could be born? We'll never know for certain, but the pattern is there. Every wife, every pregnancy, every tragedy. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's potential venereal diseases were just one thread in a tapestry of genital horror. What he did to maintain his virility reveals a shocking truth about Tudor masculinity and medical delusion. Henry VIII was desperate to be seen as virile, powerful, the ultimate man. But by his 40s, his body was betraying him. The leg wound, the weight gain, the infections, and worst of all, erectile dysfunction. This wasn't just a physical issue. This was a crisis of kingship. A king who couldn't perform in bed couldn't produce heirs, and a king without heirs was a kingdom in chaos. So Henry turned to aphrodisiacs, and Tudor aphrodisiacs were creative. First, there were the dietary solutions, oysters of course, but also roasted sparrow brains, pulverized rhino horn imported at astronomical cost, and powdered deer antlers mixed into wine. Henry consumed these religiously. Pounds of oysters, vials of powdered horn. He'd drink concoctions that tasted like mud and metal, all in the desperate hope that his body would cooperate. It didn't. The sparrow brain preparation was particularly revolting. The tiny skulls would be cracked open, the brains scooped out with a small spoon, then roasted with butter and herbs. They'd be served on toast or mixed into eggs. Henry would eat them at breakfast, a dozen tiny brains. The texture like wet, grainy paste. The taste unmentionable. But he'd force them down because some ancient text claimed sparrows were lustful birds, and their brains would transfer that lust. They didn't. So physicians escalated. They recommended warming herbs, ginger, cinnamon, cloves. These were mixed into everything, his food, his drink, even applied topically. Yes, topically, on his genitals. Imagine the scene. The king lying back while a physician rubs a paste of ginger and oil onto his penis. The burning sensation, the itching, the humiliation. The paste would be warm, almost hot. The ginger would activate, creating a tingling that quickly became burning. Henry's eyes would water. He'd grit his teeth, and the physician would nod approvingly. "You see, Your Majesty, the blood flows, the heat returns." It wasn't arousal, it was chemical irritation, but no one told Henry that. And still, nothing worked. Next came the animal remedies. Tudor medicine believed that consuming the genitals of virile animals would transfer their potency. So Henry ate bull testicles, rooster combs, even powdered wolf penis. He ate them roasted, in pies ground into powders. He gagged them down with wine and prayed for results. Bull testicles were prepared like any other meat, roasted over a fire, seasoned with salt and herbs. They had a texture like liver, but softer, more granular. And the taste, gamey, metallic, with an aftertaste that lingered for hours. Henry would sit at private dinners, cutting into these obscene delicacies, chewing mechanically, while his physicians watched expectantly. "How do you feel, Your Majesty? More vigorous?" He felt nauseated, but he'd lie and say yes, perhaps a bit more energetic, because admitting the truth meant admitting the treatments weren't working. And when that didn't work, they tried bloodletting. The theory was that Henry had too much blood, which was cooling his sexual organs, so they drained blood from his thighs, his arms, his groin. They weakened him, made him dizzy, nauseous, pale, and surprise, his sexual performance didn't improve. Finally, physicians turned to the most desperate measure: physical stimulation devices. These were primitive, often painful contraptions made from leather, wood, and metal. They were designed to encourage blood flow to the genitals. In practice, they were medieval torture devices strapped to the king's groin. We don't have detailed descriptions, thankfully, but we know they existed. We know they were used, and we know they were agony. One device, mentioned cryptically in medical texts, was a leather ring studded with small metal beads. It would be fitted around the base of the penis, tightened, and left for hours. The theory was that restricting blood flow would create pressure, which would later result in stronger blood flow when removed. In reality, it just created pain, bruising, and sometimes lasting damage. Henry wore these devices under his clothing during court appearances. He'd shift uncomfortably on his throne, face flushed, while his counsellors debated policy, unaware that their king was in active genital torture. And through it all, Henry blamed everyone but himself. He blamed his wives for being unarousing. He blamed witchcraft. He blamed God's displeasure. He never blamed his diet, his infections, his refusal to exercise, his obesity, because admitting those failures would mean admitting he wasn't the virile warrior king of his youth. And Henry's ego couldn't survive that truth. So he kept eating bull testicles, kept rubbing ginger on his penis, kept subjecting himself to humiliation after humiliation, all while his court whispered, his wives endured, and his physicians got richer. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's sexual dysfunction was directly connected to another horrifying reality: his rapidly expanding body. What he refused to acknowledge about his weight gain reveals a shocking truth about royal denial. In his youth, Henry VIII was an athlete, tall, muscular, broad-shouldered. Portraits show a handsome, vigorous king who jousted, hunted, and danced until dawn. By his death, he weighed close to 400 pounds. His waist measured 52 inches. He couldn't walk without assistance. He had to be carried upstairs by servants using a specially designed chair. This didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast. After the 1536 jousting accident, Henry stopped exercising. His leg made movement painful, so he stopped moving. But he didn't stop eating. Tudor royal feasts were legendary. Dozens of courses, roasted meats, pies stuffed with birds stuffed with other birds, sugar sculptures, marzipan castles. A single meal could contain 5,000 calories, and Henry ate like this twice a day. Breakfast, cold meats, bread, ale. Lunch, multiple roasted animals, pies, pastries, gallons of wine. Dinner, more of the same, plus sweet courses dripping with honey and cream. And between meals, snacks, constant snacks, marchpane, almond paste, sugared fruits, nuts, cheese. A typical lunch for Henry. Roasted swan, stuffed peacock, venison pie, beef in gravy, mutton chops, 3 different fish dishes, even on non-fast days, cheese course, fruit tart, sugar sculptures, and hippocras spiced sweet wine. He wouldn't just taste these, he'd eat full portions of each. His stomach stretched to accommodate the volume. His body, desperate for nutrients it wasn't getting, would signal for more food, and he'd eat more. His physicians told him to cut back. He ignored them. His advisors hinted that his size was becoming concerning. He had them dismissed, because Henry's appetite wasn't just about food. It was about power. Consumption was control. Every feast, every excess, every overflowing plate was a demonstration that he could have whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, even if it was killing him. As his weight ballooned, so did his health problems. Sleep apnea developed. Henry would stop breathing in his sleep, sometimes for terrifying stretches. Servants were instructed to wake him if he stopped snoring because silence meant he wasn't breathing. They'd hover outside his bedchamber at night, listening. The snoring would be thunderous, wet, rattling, punctuated by gasps and chokes. Then silence. 30 seconds, 45, a minute, and a servant would rush in, shake the king awake. Henry would jolt upright, gasping, eyes wide, convinced he was dying, which he was, slowly. Every night, his heart strained under the load. He'd become short of breath after just a few steps. His face would turn purple. He'd gasp like a drowning man, and his legs, already damaged by the jousting injury, were now supporting hundreds of pounds they were never designed to carry. The pressure caused varicose veins, swelling, and eventually more ulcers. His ankles disappeared into folds of swollen flesh. His calves were always discoloured, purple and red, signs of poor circulation. Sometimes the skin would crack from the pressure, weeping clear fluid that had nowhere else to go. But the worst part, Henry couldn't see it, or rather, he refused to see it. Portraits were commissioned to make him look slimmer, more regal. His clothes were specially tailored to hide the bulges, and anyone who dared suggest he was too large risked their head. Henry's denial was absolute. In his mind, he was still the athletic prince of his youth. The fact that he couldn't fit through doorways, couldn't mount a horse without a crane, couldn't see his own feet, none of that mattered. Because acknowledging his obesity would mean acknowledging his mortality. And Henry refused to be mortal. He was a king. Kings didn't die from eating too much. Kings died gloriously in battle or peacefully in their sleep. They didn't suffocate slowly under the weight of their own bodies. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's obesity was creating another catastrophic problem. His body couldn't regulate its own temperature. What happened during his final summers reveals a shocking truth about sweat, infection, and royal rot. Let's talk about Henry's smell. Because by the end of his life, the king reeked. Not just a little, not needs a bath level. We're talking eye-watering, gag-inducing, leave the room immediately stench. The sources for this are surprisingly direct. Ambassadors wrote home about the noisome odour surrounding the king. Courtiers complained, in private of course, that being summoned to Henry's presence was an assault on the senses. One French diplomat described it as the smell of rotting flesh and sour milk, mixed with something far worse. That something far worse was a combination of factors, all festering together in one royal package. First, the leg ulcer. That wound leaked constantly. Pus, blood, necrotic tissue. The bandages absorbed some of it, but not all. Not nearly all. Second, the obesity. Henry's body had developed deep folds of fat, and in Tudor England, with no regular bathing, those folds became breeding grounds for bacteria, yeast, and fungal infections. The sweat would accumulate in those creases, between his thighs, under his belly, in his armpits, and it would just stay there, festering, mixing with dead skin cells, oils, bacteria. The result was a smell unlike anything you can imagine. Sour, putrid, overwhelming. Third, his clothes. Henry wore layers, multiple layers, linen undergarments, wool doublets, velvet robes, fur cloaks, and none of it was washed, ever. Tudor laundry practices didn't involve washing clothes in the modern sense. You'd beat them with sticks, air them out, maybe sprinkle them with herbs, but you didn't submerge them in hot, soapy water. So Henry's clothes absorbed everything. Every drop of sweat, every leak from his leg, every bodily secretion. the fabrics became saturated with funk, and expensive fabrics, like velvet and fur, they held onto smells even more aggressively. They couldn't be cleaned without ruining them, so they just got worse. By the end of Henry's life, courtiers developed strategies for surviving royal audiences. They'd stand upwind if possible, they'd breathe through their mouths. Some even carried pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic herbs, which they'd hold to their noses while pretending to merely be thoughtful. Wait for it. Some courtiers rubbed mint oil under their noses before entering the king's presence. Others would chew on cloves or cinnamon sticks during audiences. Their faces set in permanent grimaces, they tried to pass off as thoughtful expressions. One courtier, according to private letters, developed a technique. He'd breathe in through his mouth, hold his breath for as long as possible while Henry spoke, then exhale slowly through his mouth while pretending to consider the king's words. This let him breathe only about once every 30 seconds, minimizing exposure. But the worst moments were in summer, when the heat made everything worse. Henry's body would overheat. He'd sweat profusely, gallons of it. The sweat would pour off him, soaking through his undershirts, darkening his doublets, dripping onto the floor. And remember, this wasn't clean sweat. This was sweat filtered through infected wounds, unwashed skin, and layers of bacterial buildup. The smell in Henry's private chambers during summer must have been apocalyptic. Windows were kept open, but there was no escaping it. Servants tasked with helping the king dress or undress would emerge gagging. Some would vomit. It was considered an occupational hazard of working close to the monarch. And Henry? He couldn't smell it anymore. He'd become nose-blind to his own rot. He'd sit in meetings, unaware that everyone around him was breathing through clenched teeth, fighting nausea, counting the seconds until they could escape. The king had become a walking biohazard, a mobile infection zone, a cautionary tale about what happens when power means never being told the truth. One summer, during a particularly hot July, an ambassador fainted during an audience with Henry. Just collapsed. Everyone assumed it was the heat. It wasn't. It was the smell. Combined with poor ventilation and Henry's insistence on keeping fires lit to balance his humours, the room had become an oven of stench. The ambassador was carried out. Henry was offended, thought the man was being dramatic, never considered that his own body might be the problem. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's external stench was nothing compared to what was happening inside his mouth. What his teeth looked like reveals a shocking truth about Tudor dentistry and sugar addiction. Smile. Go ahead. Feel your teeth with your tongue. Notice how smooth they are. How clean. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine teeth so rotten, so decayed, so covered in black tartar that they're barely recognisable as teeth. That was Henry VIII's mouth. In his portraits, you'll notice something. Henry almost never shows his teeth. It's always a closed mouth expression, lips pressed together, hiding what's underneath. Because what was underneath was a horror show. Ever had a toothache? Remember that throbbing electric pain? Now imagine that in multiple teeth, all the time, for years. Tudor England was experiencing a sugar revolution. Sugar, imported from the colonies, was the new status symbol. Only the wealthy could afford it, and Henry could afford a lot of it. He put sugar in everything. His wine, his meat sauces, his pastries, his preserves, his morning ale. He'd eat entire plates of sugar sculptures at banquets called subtleties, elaborate marzipan creations that were more art than food. And sugar, as we now know, is a bacteria's favourite meal. The bacteria in Henry's mouth fed on the constant supply of sugar. They multiplied. They produced acid, and that acid ate through his tooth enamel like water through paper. Cavities formed, deep, painful cavities that exposed the nerve. Every hot drink, every cold drink, every bite of food would send lightning bolts of pain through his jaw. But here's the thing. Tudor dentistry was not good. There were no dentists. There were barber surgeons who occasionally pulled teeth, and blacksmiths who pulled teeth when the barber surgeons were busy. Anesthesia didn't exist. Pain management meant getting drunk first. Very drunk. So Henry avoided tooth extraction as long as possible. He'd rather live with the pain than endure the procedure. And the pain was constant. Abscesses formed, pockets of infection deep in the gum. These would swell, throb, occasionally rupture, flooding his mouth with pus and blood. The taste must have been indescribable. Metallic, putrid, a constant reminder of decay. And his breath, witnesses described it as most foul. One courtier wrote that speaking with the king face to face was an endurance to be dreaded. The smell of rotting teeth, combined with infected gums, poor digestion, and a mouthful of bacteria, created a halitosis so severe it was mentioned in diplomatic correspondence. By his 40s, Henry had lost several teeth. The remaining ones were blackened stumps, loose in their sockets, barely hanging on. When he did finally submit to tooth extraction, and he did multiple times, it was a public spectacle. He'd be held down by several strong men. The barber surgeon would use iron pliers, often without proper grip, yanking and twisting until the tooth either came out or shattered. The procedure went like this. Henry would drink heavily. Wine, ale, anything to dull the pain. Then he'd be positioned in a chair, his head held firmly by two servants. The barber surgeon would approach with pliers, crude iron tools with a grip like a vice. He'd feel around in Henry's mouth for the loose tooth, gripping it firmly. Then he'd pull and pull and pull. Sometimes the tooth came out cleanly. More often, it shattered. Pieces would remain embedded in the gum, creating splinters of infected tooth that would fester for months. Henry would scream. Blood would pour from his mouth. The taste of iron and infection would flood his tongue. And when it was finally over, he'd be given wine to cleanse the wound. Sometimes pieces of tooth would remain embedded in the gum, causing infections that lasted months. And still Henry kept eating sugar, kept drinking sweetened wine, kept destroying his teeth while his physicians nodded and blamed bad humours. His mouth became a graveyard, a testament to excess, denial, and the consequences of power unchecked by reality. Because no one could tell the king his breath smelled like death. No one could force him to cut back on sugar. No one could save him from himself. He was rotting from the inside out, and everyone could smell it. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's dental nightmare was just one symptom of a deeper crisis. His entire head was a battlefield of infection. What his physicians discovered in his ears and sinuses reveals a shocking truth about the king's constant agony. By his 50s, Henry VIII was going deaf. Not completely, but enough that courtiers had to raise their voices. Enough that he'd mishear conversations, grow paranoid, accuse people of whispering about him. And he wasn't wrong to be paranoid. They were whispering. Because Henry's hearing loss came with a visible, disturbing symptom: discharge. His ears leaked, constantly. Ever had water stuck in your ear? Remember that muffled, pressured feeling? Now imagine that water is pus, and it's been there for months. That's what Henry lived with. It started as a mild annoyance, a bit of moisture, a strange pressure. But over time it became an infection, chronic, painful, and impossible to cure. Tudor physicians called it running ear. We'd call it chronic otitis media, possibly with a perforated eardrum. Here's what was happening. Bacteria, likely from his mouth, throat, or the general filth of his environment, had travelled up through the eustachian tubes into his middle ear. There, they'd set up camp, multiplying, creating pus, eating away at the delicate structures inside his ear canal. The infection created pressure, unbearable pressure, like someone was slowly inflating a balloon inside his skull. The pain would spike, sharp and sudden, making him clutch his head and scream. And then the eardrum would rupture. The pressure would release in a flood of pus and blood, pouring out of his ear, down his neck, soaking into his collar. The relief was temporary. The infection would remain, festering, until the eardrum attempted to heal. Then the cycle would start again. Henry's physicians tried everything. First, ear drops. They'd pour warm oil, sometimes mixed with vinegar or herbs, directly into his ear canal. The theory was that the oil would soften the bad humours and allow them to drain naturally. It didn't work. It just created a warm, wet environment where bacteria could thrive even more happily. Next, bloodletting near the ear, small cuts behind the ear to relieve pressure. This did nothing except create more wounds for infection to enter. Finally, the most disturbing treatment of all. They'd insert wicks. Wicks were small pieces of cloth or string, soaked in astringent herbs, then threaded deep into the ear canal. The idea was that the wick would draw out the infection. In reality, it just irritated the tissue, caused more pain, and sometimes pushed the infection deeper. Henry would sit there, a wick dangling from each ear, pus dripping onto his shoulders, while physicians nodded sagely and said, "The humours are exiting the body." The deafness wasn't just physical, it was social. It made Henry more isolated, more suspicious. He couldn't hear whispered conversations, so he assumed they were about him. He'd accuse courtiers of plotting. He'd demand louder speech, interpreting normal tones as insolence. His paranoia, already stoked by pain and illness, grew worse, and the deafness fed into it, creating a feedback loop of mistrust and rage. By the end of his life, Henry's world was muffled, punctuated by sharp pains and the constant trickle of infected fluid. He could barely hear the cries of his wives, couldn't hear the whispers of treason, couldn't hear his own courtiers begging for their lives. Just the roar of infection, the thunder inside his skull, the wet, dripping sound of his body giving up. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's ear infections were connected to an even more disgusting reality: his sinuses. What his physicians extracted from his nose reveals a shocking truth about the king's respiratory nightmare. Let's head north, up from the ears into the sinuses, because Henry's head was a disaster zone from every angle. Chronic sinus infections plagued him for years. The symptoms were relentless: facial pain, pressure behind the eyes, thick, discoloured mucus that dripped down the back of his throat constantly. He'd snort, spit, hack, trying to clear his passages, but it never worked. The infection was too deep, too entrenched. Medieval physicians believed sinus issues were caused by excess phlegm, one of the four humours, so their treatments focused on expelling phlegm, often violently. First, sneezing powders. These were mixtures of ground pepper, tobacco, and other irritants blown directly into the nostrils. The goal was to trigger violent sneezing fits that would expel the bad humours. Henry would inhale, then explode into sneezing. 20, 30, 40 sneezes in a row. His eyes would water, his nose would run. Blood vessels would burst in his face, leaving red streaks across his cheeks, and nothing would improve. Next, nasal irrigation. They'd pour warm liquid, water, vinegar, sometimes wine, directly into one nostril, with the hope it would drain out the other. In practice, this usually just made Henry gag and choke as the liquid went down the back of his throat, or worse, it would introduce new bacteria into already infected sinuses. But the real horror was the polyps. Nasal polyps are soft, non-cancerous growths that develop in the lining of the sinuses. They're usually caused by chronic inflammation, exactly what Henry had. These polyps can grow large, very large. They block nasal passages, making breathing difficult. They cause a constant sensation of pressure, and they smell, even to the person who has them. Henry's polyps were severe enough that physicians attempted removal. And here's how they did it: with a wire snare. No anesthesia, just a thin wire loop inserted through the nostril, manoeuvred around the polyp's base, then yanked tight. The polyp would be strangled, cut, and pulled out through the nose. Blood poured. Henry screamed. The pain was indescribable. The physician would have to work blind, guiding the wire by feel alone. Sometimes he'd grab healthy tissue instead of the polyp. Sometimes the polyp would tear, leaving fragments behind. Sometimes the polyp came out in one piece. Sometimes it shattered, leaving fragments embedded in the sinus cavity. When a polyp came out intact, it would be displayed to the king. Grey-pink, gelatinous, streaked with blood and mucus. "You see, Your Majesty, the corruption has been removed." Henry would look at it, this disgusting thing that had been growing inside his face, and feel hope. Maybe this time it would work. It never did, and the polyps always grew back. This procedure was repeated multiple times throughout Henry's life. Each time the trauma to his sinuses created more inflammation, which caused more polyps, which required more removals. It was a medical nightmare with no end. The infections in his sinuses also contributed to his headaches, blinding, pounding migraines that would leave him bedridden for days. He'd lie in darkness, pressing cold cloths to his face, praying for relief. Physicians would bleed him, purge him, dose him with herbal tinctures. Nothing helped. The pressure inside his skull was constant. His face swelled. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot. And the mucus, thick, yellow-green, sometimes bloody, never stopped. He'd hawk it up during meetings, spit it into bowls held by servants, blow his nose into linen handkerchiefs that were immediately discarded because they were too foul to wash. Henry's head had become a factory of infection. Ears, sinuses, teeth, all leaking, all rotting, all connected in one terrible circuit of pain. And still he ruled. Still he held court. Still he signed execution orders and made political decisions. A king whose brain was being slowly drowned in infected mucus. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's sinus infections were causing another problem: his eyesight. What he could and couldn't see reveals a shocking truth about the king's failing senses. Henry's eyes, like everything else in his body, were falling apart. By his later years, he struggled to read. Letters had to be written in large, clear script. Documents were read aloud to him. His vision was clouding, blurring, betraying him. Part of this was natural aging, what we'd now call presbyopia, the loss of near vision that happens to everyone. But Henry's vision problems went beyond normal aging. His eyes were chronically infected. The connection between his sinus infections and his eye problems was direct. The tear ducts, which drained tears from the eyes into the nasal cavity, were constantly backed up with infected mucus. This caused dacryocystitis, infection of the tear ducts. The symptoms? Swelling at the inner corners of the eyes, constant tearing, but not the clean, salty kind, the thick, gunky kind, redness, pain, and eventually abscesses. Henry's eyes would swell shut. Pus would accumulate in the corners, crusting over his lashes. He'd wake in the morning and literally have to pry his eyelids apart, breaking the seal of dried discharge. Wait for it. Here's what they didn't tell you. Sometimes Henry's eyes would be sealed so completely that servants had to soak his face with warm water for several minutes before he could open them. He'd sit there, blind, helpless, while servants dabbed at his eyes with wet cloths, slowly dissolving the crust. The King of England, unable to see his own hands, dependent on servants to give him back his vision every morning. And Tudor treatments, predictably terrible. Physicians would lance the blocked tear ducts. Using a small knife, they'd cut into the swollen area to drain the infection manually. No numbing, just a blade and a king who'd learned to endure. The pus would drain, the swelling would temporarily reduce, and within days the infection would return. They also tried eye drops made from distilled rosewater, egg whites, and sometimes breast milk. The theory was that these gentle substances would soothe the eye without causing harm. In practice, they did nothing, or worse, introduced new bacteria. Henry's failing vision had serious consequences. He couldn't hunt effectively anymore, one of his few remaining pleasures. He couldn't read his own correspondence without assistance. He had to trust others to relay information accurately. And for a paranoid king, that was intolerable. He'd accuse secretaries of lying, of hiding information, of deliberately misreading documents to deceive him. His inability to see became another source of rage, another weapon his mind used against him. The world was literally going dark, and there was nothing anyone could do. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's physical deterioration was creating a final, horrifying problem. His skin. What his body looked like beneath the royal robes reveals a shocking truth about decay and motion. Let's talk about Henry's skin. Because beneath the velvet and fur, beneath the jewelled doublets and ermine cloaks, Henry's body was covered in sores. Not just the leg ulcer, not just the hemorrhoids. We're talking full-body eruptions. Boils appeared regularly. These painful, pus-filled lumps would develop on his back, his neck, his buttocks. They'd start as small bumps, then swell to the size of walnuts, throbbing with infection. When they burst, and they always burst eventually, they'd release a flood of pus and blood, soaking into his undergarments, creating new stains, new smells, new horrors for the servants who had to handle his laundry. Carbuncles were even worse. These are clusters of boils, merged together into one massive infection site. They'd appear on Henry's shoulders, his lower back, anywhere the friction of his clothing and the pressure of his weight created perfect conditions for bacteria. The pain was intense. Carbuncles burrowed deep, infecting not just the skin, but the tissue underneath. They create cavities of pus that have to be drained. And once again, Tudor medicine had a solution. Lancing. A physician would heat a blade, then cut into the carbuncle, creating an opening for the pus to escape. The king would grit his teeth, maybe grip the arms of his chair, while the infection poured out. Sometimes, the cavity was so deep that the physician had to pack it with cloth to keep it draining. This cloth would be left in place for days, slowly pulled out as the infection cleared, except the infection never fully cleared. New boils would appear, new carbuncles would form. Henry's skin was a battlefield, and the bacteria were winning. His obesity made everything worse. The folds of fat rubbed together, creating friction, heat, moisture, perfect conditions for yeast and bacterial infections. He developed intrigo, raw inflamed rashes in the creases of his body, under his arms, between his thighs, beneath his belly. These rashes would crack, bleed, ooze, and you thought your rash was bad. The intrigo was particularly horrific under Henry's belly. The massive fold of fat would trap sweat, bacteria, dead skin cells. The rash would develop, red and angry. Then it would crack, deep fissures in the skin that wept clear fluid and blood. The pain was constant. Any movement would pull on the cracked skin. Walking, sitting, even breathing deeply would cause fresh splits. And the smell from these infected folds was its own unique horror. Not quite like the leg wound, not quite like the hemorrhoids. Something else, something fungal and sweet and utterly repulsive. Servants tried to manage it with powders, oils, and herbal poultices, but nothing stopped the progression. Henry's skin had become paper-thin in some places, thickened and leathery in others, scars from old infections layered over new ones. His body was a map of suffering, every mark a battle fought and lost, and he couldn't hide it, not from himself, not from the servants who dressed him, not from the physicians who examined him. He'd look down at his own body, swollen, scarred, leaking, and see the truth his courtiers wouldn't speak. He was rotting, actively, visibly rotting while still alive. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's skin infections were symptoms of a much larger problem, his body's complete inability to heal itself. What modern doctors believe was happening inside his bloodstream reveals a shocking truth about systemic infection. Here's where it all comes together. The leg ulcer, the boils, the sinus infections, the hemorrhoids, the dental abscesses, every single one of these was a potential entry point for bacteria into Henry's bloodstream. And in Tudor England, once bacteria entered the blood, you were on borrowed time. Modern physicians who've studied Henry's medical history believe he was experiencing chronic low-grade sepsis for years, maybe even decades. Sepsis occurs when the body's response to infection becomes so aggressive that it starts attacking its own tissues. The immune system goes haywire, inflammation spreads, organs begin to fail. Symptoms include fever, rapid heartbeat, confusion, extreme fatigue, and eventually, septic shock and death. Henry experienced many of these symptoms regularly. His fevers were documented, his rages and paranoia, possibly exacerbated by confusion and delirium. His exhaustion was so severe that he'd sometimes sleep for 15 or 16 hours straight. But here's the thing about chronic sepsis. It's a slow burn. It doesn't kill you in days. It kills you over years, degrading your body system by system until there's nothing left. And that's exactly what happened to Henry. Every infection, every boil, every abscess was releasing bacteria into his blood. His immune system, already weakened by obesity, poor diet, and chronic illness, couldn't keep up. His organs began to fail. His kidneys struggled to filter toxins. His liver became enlarged and sluggish. His heart, forced to pump blood through hundreds of pounds of tissue, began to falter. And Tudor physicians had no concept of this. They didn't understand infection on a microscopic level. They didn't know about bacteria, about sepsis, about the cascading failures happening inside the king's body. They just saw symptoms: fever, bleed him; confusion, purge him; fatigue, more leeches. Every treatment made things worse. Every bloodletting weakened his immune system further. Every purge dehydrated him, stressing his kidneys. Henry was being slowly killed by the very people trying to save him. And he knew something was wrong. He could feel it, the constant exhaustion, the way his body didn't bounce back anymore, the infections that never fully healed. But admitting systemic failure would mean admitting he was dying. And Henry refused, so he kept eating, kept demanding treatments, kept raging at the world for his body's betrayal, while his blood turned to poison, while his organs shut down, while his body consumed itself from within. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's medical nightmare had one final grotesque chapter: his death. What happened to his body in those final days reveals a shocking truth about the consequences of a lifetime of filth. January 1547. Henry VIII is dying. Everyone knows it. He knows it. But the king refuses to acknowledge it publicly. To speak of the king's death is treason. So the court pretends. They smile, they bow, they ignore the smell, because by now Henry is barely recognizable as human. His body has swollen to monstrous proportions, not just fat, fluid. His heart, failing under the strain of years of abuse, can no longer pump efficiently. Fluid accumulates in his tissues. His legs swell to the size of tree trunks. His face puffs until his features blur. The leg ulcer, which had occasionally closed in previous years, is now permanently open. A gaping wound leaking continuously. The infection has spread deep into the bone, into the muscle. The smell is so overwhelming that servants have to rotate out of his chamber every few minutes. He can't walk, can't stand, can barely sit upright. He's carried everywhere on a specially constructed chair that requires 4 strong men to lift. The wood creaks under the weight, the men grunt with effort, and Henry, the once mighty athlete, the warrior king, sits there helpless, wheezing, his breath rattling in his chest. He knows death is coming. He calls for Archbishop Cranmer. They talk. The Archbishop holds his hand. Henry asks him to give a sign if he dies in faith. On January 28th, at around 2 a.m, Henry VIII squeezes Cranmer's hand, and then he's gone. But the nightmare doesn't end there. Henry's body, already in a state of advanced decay, begins decomposing immediately. Remember, this is winter, but the chambers are heated, and Henry's body is full of infection, pus and fluids. Decomposition happens fast in bodies like this. Gases build up inside. The abdomen distends. The skin takes on a greenish hue, and the smell, already horrific when he was alive, becomes unbearable. His body is prepared for transport. They wrap him in cerecloth, wax-impregnated fabric meant to contain decomposition. They place him in a lead-lined coffin. They seal it. And then they begin the journey from Westminster to Windsor for burial. It takes several days, and somewhere along the route, the pressure inside the coffin becomes too much. The gases, the fluids, the decomposing mass that was once a king, it all erupts. The coffin cracks. Some accounts say it explodes. The lead splits, the cerecloth tears, and Henry's remains leak out. The smell is apocalyptic. The fluids seep through the wood, drip onto the floor of the church where the coffin has been placed overnight. And here's where the story gets even darker. There are accounts, possibly apocryphal, but repeated in multiple sources, that dogs broke into the church and licked at the fluids leaking from the king's coffin. It's a grotesque, almost biblical image. Henry VIII, who had ruled with absolute power, who had broken with Rome, who had beheaded wives and advisors, reduced to a rotting mass being scavenged by animals. Servants cleaned the mess as best they could. The coffin was resealed. The onward journey continued, and eventually Henry was buried, deep in the ground, sealed away. His body finally, blessedly, stopped leaking. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's death wasn't just the end of one man's suffering, it was a warning. What his legacy teaches us about power denial and the consequences of unchecked excess reveals a shocking truth about human nature itself. We've talked about infections, about rotting wounds, about sweat and stench. But here's the foundation of it all. Henry almost never bathed. And it wasn't laziness, it was medical advice. Tudor physicians believed that bathing was dangerous. The theory went like this. Hot water opens the pores. Open pores allow disease to enter the body. Therefore, bathing makes you sick. This wasn't fringe medicine. This was mainstream medical consensus, reinforced by the church, which viewed public bathhouses as dens of sin and promiscuity. So wealthy Tudors, including Henry, avoided full-body immersion in water, maybe once or twice a year. Maybe. Instead, they practiced dry washing. They'd wipe their skin with linen cloths, sometimes dampened slightly with rose water or vinegar, but no soap, no scrubbing, no actual removal of the layers of sweat, oil, and bacteria. Imagine living like this. Imagine going months, years without feeling clean water on your entire body. Without that sensation of being truly clean, your skin would become a layered ecosystem. Dead cells accumulating, oils oxidizing, bacteria colonizing every pore. And this wasn't just a personal choice. This was the cultural norm. Everyone did it. Peasants, nobles, clergy. The only difference was that peasants, ironically, were probably cleaner because they swam in rivers and streams out of necessity. Henry had access to elaborate bathing chambers, rooms with large wooden tubs, heated water systems, scented oils, but he barely used them. And when he did bathe, it was a production. Dozens of servants preparing the water, testing the temperature, adding herbs and oils. Henry would soak for maybe 30 minutes, then immediately be dried and dressed to prevent the dangerous airs from entering his open pores. The rest of the time, stale, unwashed, marinating in his own filth. This water phobia had real consequences. Skin infections that could have been prevented with regular bathing flourished. Wounds became contaminated with bacteria from unwashed hands and bodies. The cycle of infection perpetuated itself, and no one questioned it, because to question it would be to question centuries of medical wisdom, church teaching, and cultural practice. So Henry, like everyone else, lived in his own filth, convinced that water was the enemy, convinced that staying dirty was staying safe, while his body rotted, while infections spread, while the very thing that could have helped him, basic hygiene, was actively avoided. It's perhaps the greatest tragedy of Tudor medicine. They had water, They had soap. They had the ability to clean themselves, but they were too afraid. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's refusal to bathe was connected to another horrifying practice: his approach to clothing. What he wore and what he refused to change reveals a shocking truth about fabric, bacteria, and royal stubbornness. Let's be clear about something. Henry VIII was covered in parasites, head to toe, constantly. Lice in his hair, lice in his beard, lice in his eyebrows, fleas in his clothes, bed bugs in his mattress, mites in his skin. This wasn't rare, this was normal. Everyone had parasites, rich and poor, clean and dirty. It was simply accepted as part of life. But Henry's infestation was spectacular, because his body provided 5-star accommodations for parasites. First, the hair. Henry's hair was never properly washed, maybe rinsed occasionally, but never treated with anything that would actually kill lice. So head lice thrived. They'd lay eggs called nits in his hair and beard. These nits would hatch, mature, feed on his scalp, and lay more eggs. The itching was constant. Henry would scratch until his scalp bled. Servants would pick lice from his hair during grooming sessions, crushing them between fingernails. But for every louse removed, a dozen remained. Body lice lived in his clothes. These parasites can't survive on skin, they need fabric. So they'd hide in the seams of his linen undergarments, emerging to feed on his body several times a day. Each bite created a small red welt. Hundreds of these welts covered Henry's body. He'd scratch them open, causing infections. The lice would feed on the infected wounds, spreading bacteria. It was a perfect symbiotic relationship. Henry provided food and shelter. The lice provided misery. Fleas were even worse. They'd infest his bedding, his carpets, his fur cloaks. They'd jump from surface to surface, landing on him, biting, then jumping away. Flea bites itch intensely, and unlike lice, fleas can transmit diseases: plague, typhus, tularemia. Every flea was a potential death sentence. But here's the thing, people didn't understand disease transmission. They didn't know that fleas carried plague. They didn't know that lice could spread typhus. They just knew they itched, and everyone itched, so it wasn't worth worrying about. Tudor attempts at parasite control were pathetic. They'd sprinkle herbs like lavender and wormwood in clothing and bedding. These herbs smell nice. They do absolutely nothing to kill lice or fleas. Some people wore flea furs, strips of fur meant to attract fleas away from the body. The idea was that fleas would prefer the fur to human skin. They didn't. Fleas are opportunists. They'll bite whatever's available. And bed bugs, forget it. Tudor beds were wooden frames with rope mesh, topped with straw-stuffed mattresses. Perfect hiding places for bed bugs, which would emerge at night to feed on sleeping humans. Henry would wake up covered in new bites. His servants would wake up covered in new bites. The entire court was a mobile insect colony, and no one thought this was a problem. It was just life. You itched, you scratched, you occasionally found a louse and crushed it, and then you went about your day. Except Henry's day involved ruling an empire, making life and death decisions, negotiating with foreign powers, all while being slowly drained by parasites and driven mad by itching. His famous irritability, at least partially explained by constant, relentless, inescapable itching. Try concentrating on diplomatic negotiations when body lice are feeding on your torso. Try remaining patient when fleas are biting your ankles and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't. No one can. And Henry didn't. He'd snap, he'd rage, he'd order executions for minor offences because his body was a prison of itching, pain and parasitic invasion. And still, he never bathed, never properly washed his clothes, never took the steps that might have actually helped. Because in Tudor England, those steps didn't exist. The knowledge didn't exist. The infrastructure didn't exist. So Henry suffered, and so did everyone around him. But what passengers didn't know was that Henry's parasite infestation was connected to one final disgusting practice: his attitude toward cleanliness itself. What he believed about hygiene reveals a shocking truth about royal pride and willful ignorance. Here's the twisted core of Henry's hygiene philosophy. He believed cleanliness was beneath him, not explicitly, not stated outright, but embedded in the culture of Tudor aristocracy was the belief that excessive concern with hygiene was common, peasant-like, unroyal. Real nobles had servants to handle the dirty work. Real nobles wore expensive fabrics and jewels that distracted from any filth underneath. Real nobles didn't concern themselves with something as mundane as washing. Henry embodied this perfectly. He had hundreds of servants whose entire jobs revolved around managing his body. Grooms to wipe him, servants to dress him, physicians to treat him, laundresses to handle his linens. But he never took personal responsibility for his own hygiene. That would be admitting that he, the king, was subject to the same bodily functions as commoners. And Henry's ego couldn't handle that. When foreign ambassadors commented on English customs, polite code for "you people smell terrible," Henry bristled. How dare they? He was anointed by God. His body was sacred. Any suggestion that he was dirty was an attack on his divine right to rule. This attitude filtered down through the court. Courtiers competed to show how little they cared about hygiene. To be too clean was to be trying too hard, to be insecure, to be new money. Old money, true nobility, could afford to stink. And the church reinforced this. Cleanliness of the soul mattered. Cleanliness of the body was vain, worldly, even sinful. Saints were praised for their filthiness, for embracing bodily, all-come mortification. Henry wasn't a saint, but he was convinced of his own righteousness, and in his mind, his body's decay was irrelevant. It was his soul that mattered, except, of course, when his body's decay prevented him from walking, eating, thinking, or ruling effectively. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. Decades of neglect, compounded by bad medicine and worse advice, had created a body in systemic collapse. And Henry, stubborn to the end, refused to admit that maybe, just maybe, some basic hygiene might have helped. Because that would mean admitting weakness, admitting humanity, admitting that a king's body could fail just like anyone else's. And Henry VIII never admitted defeat, not to France, not to the Pope, not to his wives, and not to the bacteria consuming him from within. So what do we learn from Henry VIII's disgusting hygiene practices? That power doesn't protect you from biology. That wealth can't buy cleanliness if you refuse to pursue it. That ego, stubbornness, and cultural norms can turn a preventable problem into a life-destroying catastrophe. Henry's story is grotesque, but it's also weirdly relevant. We laugh at Tudor hygiene, we cringe at their medical practices, we thank whatever gods we worship that we live in an age of antibiotics and indoor plumbing. But we still make the same mistakes. We ignore medical advice we don't like. We prioritize comfort over health. We let pride prevent us from seeking help. Henry's infected leg, that's the smoker who refuses to quit. His obesity, that's the person who knows they need to change their diet but doesn't. His festering wounds, that's anyone who ignores a health problem until it becomes a crisis. The details are different, but the pattern is the same. Henry VIII had everything. Power, wealth, resources, access to the best, such as it was, medicine of his time. And he died at 55, swollen, infected, rotting, leaking, in agony, because he couldn't admit he needed to change. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, in your climate-controlled room, with your indoor plumbing and your antibiotics and your toothbrush, maybe think about Henry. Think about what happens when pride trumps reality, when cultural norms override common sense, when power means never being told the truth. And maybe, just maybe, take a shower. Because history's greatest lesson might just be this: even kings have to wash their arse. Sweet dreams.